10:35, recommence. Councillors, I need a order to suspend standing orders and move in the agenda to item 334, the Planning and Development Report, so we can receive our officers from real planning. Move Councillor People, second Councillor Gleeson. Any opposition? There being none. All in favour? Carried 7-0. So we are now moving to agenda item 334, which commences on page 49. But the discussion that real planning will be leading us through is more broader and covers a whole range of issues. So some of it is obviously directly referenced in our report. Any questions we have, so what we might do is quickly go through any issues that you as councillors may have had questions for relevant to this, and then we'll ask the team from real planning. They may say, well, that's part of what we're going to talk about generally. Otherwise, we can let them lead the conversation. Councillor Plum. No one had an MPI or a COI in any of this, did they?
Well, Mr Mayor, we're going to discuss number 2, General Planning Service Inquiries and Advice, in depth. I'll have to leave it alone.
If we're going to discuss which, sorry, Councillor, I couldn't hear you.
Number 2.
Levy.
General Planning Services.
The flood levy, yes, we are going to be discussing that, so we need to update the record for prescribed COIs, please, Jess. Councillor Plum is declaring a prescribed COI in agenda item 334 due to a close association with a...
Oh, that's 332, number 2.
For item number 2. The councillors, hold all of your questions about the levy bank, which is an integral part of this presentation. Just wait for a moment to be a part of... We'll do everything else first and the levy bank last, so you can stay in the record.
No, I'm not listening what I'm trying to say.
Oh. Well, I'm not sure what number 2 is, sorry.
In the agenda.
Yep.
Yeah?
Yep.
Yeah.
So that's as well as the levy bank. So the levy bank, that's what I was looking for, is not number 2.
No, that was number 2.
So declaring it in item 2 and item 1, reference 113. So any discussion about the levy bank or the planning inquiries regarding commercial premises? Right, councillors, question?
Mr Mayor, the discussions about the levy bank, they are options, as in we're not, it's not a position that we're likely to make a decision as to what we do for that flood mitigation. It's probably a better term.
No, certainly, and not. It's options, and discussing the planning process around what our options are in that respect. That's okay.
Mr Mayor, I'll ask about the levy bank also. In the past, I've been told that anything to do with the ski park, if you've had anything to do with that, and levy was part of that, you should exempt yourself from the standard.
The nature of this discussion and advice from the officers will be around what our mitigation options are. It's information that you individually as councillors are entitled to receive by way of request, so there's no decision will arise as a result of, and no unfair advantage would be able to be gained. We're still in open session, so only an individual councillor can determine their PCOIs. My advice is that I wouldn't be raising this as an issue with you if you did not. I don't see it. Just receiving information about what council's options are from a planning perspective with respect to an ongoing development issue.
Yeah, I agree, but I just, because I've been in the past told that I've had supplied to that park down there, I don't know what it is. Mr Mayor,
I think that issue and element would be relevant when we're making a determination around a decision relating to the awarding of a contract to mitigate, construct, buy, whatever it is. Then your PCOIs that council as president got become relevant, receiving information about that and auctioneering just to understand, so that you and your role as a councillor can be briefed on what steps there are in the planning process and options council has. I've got no problem with you being briefed on that.
Right, thank you.
Right. Questions unrelated to either the levy bank, now that we've talked about it, or the commercial premises? Do any other officers have anything to draw to our attention? Perhaps Warren?
Look, yes, the purpose of today is to give you an update on Waratah and the power station applications with the council. So Stephen's been working closely, Stephen from our office has been working closely with Waratah, Bill Hazler and their planning consultant. So Stephen, I'll hand over to you to give an update on where you're up to with the draft infrastructure agreement and the sort of heads of considerations that are going to be included in that infrastructure agreement with Waratah.
Can I just ask officers, do you expect anything you're about to brief us on will be commercial or confident? The need to maintain confidence to close the session, or?
No.
Right, thank you.
No, it's not.
Thanks, Greg, and thanks, Mr. Owen. Thanks for having us, everyone. Today we're talking about, I'll just get the item number there. It's 1.1.5, which is the power station north of Alpha, component of which is Waratah Coal. So this one's been going on for a little while. It's obviously quite complicated being a coal-fired power station. It's currently what we call a material change of use application. It's subject to code assessment, which is quite obscure. It relates to how it's defined. Obviously, planning schemes aren't generally drafted to contemplate coal-fired power stations, so it's a bit interesting. It's also the old planning scheme that applies, so it's a bit out of date.
So when you say it's obscure, it's just that for something of such a large scale to not have to go through an impact assessment process, it's a bit unusual, but we were comfortable that it fitted within the major public utility definition in the planning scheme.
Yeah, I think there's even legal advice to that.
Yeah,
so that's all being kind of dealt with, I suppose.
So it is a code assessable application, so there won't be any public notification of the power station application.
Yeah, correct. So in planning, we have code assessment and impact assessment. Code assessment is your bounded assessment, where it's assessed against purely the planning scheme codes, and that's it. And that's all that council can actually have regard to. There are a couple of other options, but in all essence, like that's what you can do. With impact assessment, it's a broader assessment where we can factor in different things. So the applicant has been very good in terms of their ability to talk to us and work with us. They're happy to work with council in terms of making sure that the community sees it as a positive. They're not, I suppose, trying to be adversarial through the process. They want to work with council to make sure that everyone wins, that there's no lose out of the situation. So certainly in my discussions with them, they are open to entertaining a number of different things to make sure that they're not burdening people. At the present time at least, they're not trying to be difficult. That could change obviously. The reason I raise this is because you're in a code assessment process, there are prescribed timeframes around your decision. You don't have to make a decision today, you're not in the decision making period. But moving forward, there is the potential for them to issue what we call a deemed approval if council doesn't decide in time. Based on my discussions today with the applicant, I don't believe they go down that path because that all of a sudden signals they don't want to play nicely. I think they're going to play nicely and allow you to extend as required. In terms of where we're at with the assessment process, it's currently in the state assessment phase, so it required referral to the state assessment referral agency for various matters. There's been backwards and forwards between the applicant and the state on varying matters which are of state jurisdiction, and I won't bother with those today just because we can focus on the council issues. At the moment, the period for the state referral is stopped, so the applicant has the ability to stop it. That allows them time to effectively negotiate with the state to a resolution. The next step we will see is that the state will issue a referral response. The latest advice I have from the applicant is that is expected in early February. From that period, then the applicant would restart the actual relevant period, and then we move towards council's decision-making period. That's when your 25 business days starts to decide it. Now, under the Planning Act, you're required to decide it within 25 business days. I expect it will take much longer to negotiate with the applicant around how an approval would look for that development. So where we're heading towards this is an approval of the development. It's generally consistent with what we expect. We are limited in terms of what we can actually assess it against. And the big overriding issue is around infrastructure and how they deal with infrastructure. In terms of moving forward, the two primary mechanisms we need to discuss are conditioning and approval to ensure that they're required to do everything they should do, but also an infrastructure agreement between council and the applicant to ensure that they meet their obligations in terms of providing infrastructure. Ultimately, this site is outside your priority infrastructure area, so it's not anticipated. So they're required.
Just on that, Stephen, yeah, the priority infrastructure area is a serviced area around Alpha. There is a line on a map in the new planning scheme, or the draft planning scheme, which identifies that area.
There's also the old
and the old planning scheme also had a similar boundary. So anything, a major development like this outside your priority infrastructure area, where you're focusing your energy on servicing, providing basic urban services, council has the ability to enter into an infrastructure agreement to ensure that all council's issues are appropriately addressed, and whether that be roads or water or whatever. But Stephen, just before we talk about the individual items that might be addressed in that agreement, because we do have a draft agreement that has been circulated, which we will show to council and its engineers, to get an idea of the scale of this power station, the construction timetable potentially is over a 5-year period.
Yeah, so they're talking about 2 generators, so 2 different stages. It takes them 5 years to construct 1 generator. So we're talking a rather large facility. In terms of general context, this is linked to a coal mine, is the word I'm looking for, west of the facility, and the coal mine will actually then service the power station. So there's no kind of movement of coal, it just comes straight across, goes to the power station, job done. In terms of that timing, we're talking effectively to 2025, they're looking at building the first stage and then moving on to the second stage to 2030. In terms of how big a construction we're looking at 1,000 people to construct this thing. So it's a major project for the region for a long time. So the reason we're taking great interest in it, and obviously around the infrastructure as well, is because it's going to not just this council but every council moving forward in Buckhaldern, making sure that, you know, at the end of the life or towards the end of life, you're not up for issues relating to that development. So making sure that they service, I think operational workforce is around 100 people.
The operational aspect of the station is 90 to 100 people.
90 to 100 people. So it's a significant investment in the region by someone. For reference, the coal mine is completely separate to this project. We're solely worrying about the power station. The coal mine's being dealt with by the state as a coordinated project.
And the power station is outside the mining lease area.
Yes.
That has been subject to a separate environmental impact statement, the Waratah coal application.
So for council's consideration today, it is purely the power station. There is obviously a level of linkage to it. And some of the conditioning we have been talking about is ensuring that we don't get a situation where they start using the power station and the coal mine doesn't exist. So naturally tying those together. Did anyone else have anything in general terms? Otherwise, I'll just talk.
Well, the only thing I'd say in general terms is it's just mind-boggling that the state hasn't coordinated the mine and the power station together. It's
I find that mind-boggling, Mr. Mayor.
Massive development that they've effectively left, which I've got no problem with because I've got full confidence in our planning team and the councillors to make the right decision, but
it's now your responsibility to deal with.
You've left it to us.
Yes.
And the only reason that I can think that is because of the politically sensitive nature of it being not a power station, it's a coal-fired power station.
I think there's 2, and you've hit the nail on the head with that one, but I also understand the initial plan from the applicant was just to have the coal mine and then move the coal somewhere else.
That's right.
And they proceeded with the process and then realised we can't actually get the coal easily away from the line. What can we do to use our own coal? And power station is obviously a reasonably easy way to use their own coal.
Economically, that side of it all makes perfect sense because it's much easier to build a power transmission line and send the power out than it is to send the coal out on a railway line.
Do it all on
200 kilometres of floodplain, so it
Exactly.
makes perfect sense.
Yeah. I think they were so far down the coal mine coordinated process that having to restart, add a power station in and then keep going, it was much easier for them to just use it as a standalone component. The other benefit they've got is they can proceed under 2 approvals then.
I have to agree with that last bit. I only raised it as an issue, not because I'm concerned, as in they can use whatever process they like.
It's certainly
It's
interesting put it that way.
Yeah, well, it's more than interesting though. It places a heightened degree of responsibility on council's planning process.
It does.
And we are unfortunately operating under an extremely dated planning process for that area that doesn't necessarily recognise the real potential impacts of heavy industrial or heavy resource extraction type activities. So we're obviously bound to operate within that planning scheme. That's not changeable, but to some extent exposes council and, you know, our long-term strategic planning around the fact that we're going to be making a decision around the biggest economic activity to hit this area in, you know, use the rail line.
Completely agree, and I think, as you know, we're drafting the planning scheme as well. Certainly, if you ask me, is the planning scheme set up to assess a coal-fired power station, I'd say no, you'd expect that to be a coordinated project. So even the most modern planning scheme, I don't think would ever contemplate something of that nature. I think it would just have a little bit more teeth in it to do whatever you wanted to with it.
So just to that end, sorry, Greg, to that end, I would certainly not going to abrogate our responsibility in this, because when you give it to somebody else to decide or pass it away, or if that was even possible, which I don't even want to discuss, but if there is anything state development, planning and local government all now fall within one department, I would have absolutely no hesitation if we needed assistance with something and jumping on a plane and going through to asking for it, because there would be very few, if any, other local governments in the state that have ever had to deal with an approval of this magnitude.
Yeah, I think realistically the contribution to the state economy that you're now deciding, it's almost an unfair burden on you to be making that decision and having to wear the responsibility of doing that. That's why we have the coordinated project process. Ultimately, from a coordinated project, there are obligations on council, but the state assists you in working those out. At the moment, you're kind of going it solo because you're required to. I think at the end of the day, anyone could lob in an application for a coal-fired power station. I could do it next week somewhere if I wanted to, and you'd have to assess that as well. So it's an awkward situation to be in, but we can certainly navigate through it.
And the last point that I wanted to raise, specifically relevant to that, is the last point you raised prior to my interruption, is because it's not a coordinated project, we do have the problem of an approved coal mine, reverse of that, an approved coal-fired power station, if we proceed through and get it all approved, with no coal mine attached.
Well, no certainty about when the coal mine's
certainly no certainty, which brings in complications around they may choose still to want to operate, buy the coal and get it in there through some other means, which obviously then impacts the state road network or the state rail network, which impacts on the design around, you know, or the community potential for both positive and negative impact. So those conditions are in the fact that they're separated is actually in some ways not a good thing around surety for either of the two projects. Whereas if they're linked, then there is at least an understanding of if one happens when, you know, night follows day. There's no night follows day with these two separate projects.
Completely agree. So the applicant and I had a very broad-ranging discussion about the nuts and bolts of everything in late December last year, hence why we're now here to be able to give you an update. I was very frank with him around ensuring that council's interests are protected, and also the idea specifically you're speaking about there, where they may change things, like these things are big projects. They change as the economy changes, as their plans change. So we were talking about, one thing I've already tabled with them is the idea to condition that they wouldn't truck coal in there at all. So not necessarily linking them to the mine, just in case they go somewhere else with the mine, at the end of the day they can bring it in, but effectively no trucking of the coal to the site using a council road. So if they want to go and build a private road to bring it in, or there's a rail line or something like that, so be it. But effectively we're looking at what impact could any change that they're going to do have on council. To me, road network is the primary thing. If they're going to start trying to truck coal down a local road, you don't want that happening. So it's a flat out, we're assuming, and the whole purpose of conditions is to effectively bound the development that you have assessed, to make it clear this is the field of play that we had. If you stray out of that, then you're going to have to change your approval. Just to be clear on what we assumed we were assessing when we did. So something like that, and that's ahead of a kind of condition which would then be obviously fleshed out in terms of, but the principle of the idea of it has to be from the mine. You can't start bringing it in from somewhere else. There has to be that intrinsic connection. Has been raised with them. They're accepting of that. So we have that on board at the moment there, and we can certainly push and make sure whatever condition we impose covers every potential eventuality.
And if subsequently down the track they wanted to change their operation, they can apply.
And that's the brilliance of the system.
Waived or reviewed.
Yeah, if they all of a sudden find that there's a mine somewhere over there and they might need to truck it down a kilometre of road, they can come and apply to change it, and then we look at that at the time when you're opening, and you might have to force them to upgrade the road or something, or you might say, no, we're not going to.
And there's a test in the legislation, Mr Mayor, about substantially different development. You know, is the change substantially different development?
Yeah, are you using 200 kilometres of council road, for example, or are you, as you say, using 10 kilometres? That's minor impacted.
So the focus in the infrastructure...
Sorry, can I just interrupt? Councillor Peebles, do you want to talk about something specific to that question?
Yes, it was just on the road section. You said there that, Stephen, I think you said that they wouldn't be able to use our roads.
For the transport
For
of
the
coal.
trucking of coal.
Yeah. Would that be the case? I'm happy for them to use our roads as long as they're going to help with the infrastructure and the maintenance on our roads.
Yeah, the issue is around the conditions, and then the infrastructure agreement requires to impose them are on the basis that they aren't trucking coal on your roads. So the concern I'd have is we don't impose that condition, there's nothing to stop them then changing their plans and using your roads. If they wanted to in the future, what the right protocol would be to come back to change that condition, identify clearly where they're looking at hauling, and then you look at either amending an infrastructure agreement or to cover whatever roads. So the infrastructure agreement we're talking about gets into intimate detail as to literally which kilometres of which roads you're constructing to which standard. The concern is if in the future they're going to build it somewhere and we don't know, you don't know which exact roads we're talking about upgrading. So there's nothing to stop them in the future from doing that. It's just to avoid a situation where they have open slather on doing whatever they want and you're playing catch up with them.
Okay, but we can negotiate a deal with them to
and
use our roads, and then they help us with
The
maintenance.
problem is that the initial negotiation is we design and build a road to this standard for their usage
between
that they
change
pay
X
for,
and change
you
X.
know, which will be predominantly for passenger vehicles and heavy vehicles, but not necessarily coal transport. And the volume of traffic changes, and then all of a sudden, if we haven't conditionalised that it's not okay for them to go and cart coal on that road, the road could, might be constructed to a big enough standard, might have enough overtake lanes, might have,
Yeah, and the Mayor raises a good point. When we're talking about coal haulage, if you've ever seen a coal haulage road, they're ridiculously constructed. It's like multiple layers of bitumen, pavement to all kinds
Can I use a specific example of where this has been failed in the planning process? The state failed the Dawson Developmental Road from Ralston to Minerva Mine. So there's no rail line for the Ralston mine. The Dawson Road is completely destroyed. It is the most dangerous road in central Queensland at the moment because the trucks are carting, I think there's something like 16 loaded coal trucks every 6 hours going on that road. So the standard of road wasn't constructed prior to the development, it wasn't constructed to a standard to handle the volume of heavy vehicle traffic that it's now handling as a result of that mine, and it's been used as the haul road right through the centre of Springsure, and the road's just destroyed, it's non-existent. So what we're saying here is we're not going to preclude them from doing that in the future, but there'll be a renegotiation of the infrastructure agreement to upgrade the road to a standard that matches the increase in heavy vehicle traffic on that portion.
And at that stage, they clearly identify the route, and then you'd actually say, right, this route on a map, you're upgrading that to a standard where it's not going to fall apart and be a community safety issue effectively.
And because this is on our road, see, like the state have been derelict in my opinion because that's on their road. It's not a council road, but these roads would be effectively the ones that we could control would be from the Cap Highway in.
Yeah. And the only other question, Mr Mayor, quickly was you said 1,000 people required for the construction.
Yep.
So that would be 1,000 people over that 10-year period.
Yes.
Thank you.
That's the information. I could get a further breakdown if you'd like about that. That's the number we've been
That's
given.
in the application material.
Yeah, councillors, we were briefed on that. Remember they had the spike graphs where they ramped up, reached a pinnacle.
There are different periods, and I can't imagine it would be 1,000 fully. There's obviously, they have to build a road into it, obviously, and then there's different periods of constructing. So I can imagine it would fluctuate, but we're talking about a substantial number of people for a substantial period.
I think from memory on that graph, the highest actual construction jobs in any 12-month period was about 500 to 600. And that was at about years 2, 3, 4 of the construction for each boiler.
And that'd be when they're ramping up.
That's right. So there's 1,000 construction jobs, but those jobs don't each last for the 5 years per. So, as
Okay,
Stephen's correct in saying that someone, once the road's built, the road builders aren't there anymore, and once
So they might have to come back later on and do something else.
Correct. So I think the maximum construction jobs in a 12-month period they were envisaging was between, I actually think the exact figure is 580 that they stipulated, but it's between 500 and 600.
The other thing with these things is you have almost like a year of commissioning as well, where they have to test it, warm it up and do everything. So you kind of build it and then you have to get it ready to actually produce electricity. So there's different phases of the construction, I suppose.
Yeah.
Look, the only thing I was going to say, Mr Mayor, is that this is not an application that's been done on the back of an envelope either, that they are treating it seriously, and it's not just, you know, someone sort of not being committed to the process. I think the application fees that they paid council for the planning and engineering assessment were in the order of $50,000 to $60,000. So it's not the ratepayers subsidising the assessment of this application, which, you know, may or may not go ahead. So there is an extensive amount of work involved. A lot of negotiations. Will be working closely with Rick to set the conditions. The information request that council sent out was very comprehensive. It benefited from Michaela's involvement in Emerald and the Central Highlands mines and all the infrastructure upgrades around Emerald. So we're in a position of strength with the information request that council did issue, and now Stephen is working through this infrastructure agreement, which we'll be working with Rick about as well.
Yeah.
So do you want to talk about the sort of broad areas that it's going to be covering off on?
I can do that. What I'll do is just, I've got a bit of a table which I can circulate to the councillors, and once it's kind of finalised, and just understanding each of the arrangements. There's a construction phase and obviously an operational phase, how each infrastructure network would be dealt with, and how we're currently angling to kind of make sure that's covered. The other thing I suppose I would just point out is that this is multi-million, if not billion-dollar project. The kind of money required to upgrade roads and upgrade sewer and all that, in the grand scheme of their project, is not a lot of money. So if they can just spend $2 million solving a road, I think to be quite honest, they're in a position where they'll just do it. You know, it's a lot easier for them to just solve the problem and be done. So I think council has an opportunity to make sure that they're comfortable with things. We're not talking about a penny pinching kind of developer who's going to try and skimp on a couple of $1,000s here or there. They want to do it right and just get on with it. So there is an opportunity there. Certainly in the kind of discussions they've been having around community infrastructure, they're willing to make contributions in that regard. So the betterment of the community. So again, there's an opportunity there for council to actually see an improvement, not just covering off on the impact they're going to have in terms of the more hard and fast roads, water infrastructure we're talking, but actually to get some new facilities as a benefit of having that facility in your local government.
Which is effectively just a down payment on injurious affection anyway.
Yeah, true.
If viewed through the same models as I use.
Yeah. At the end of the day, they're obliged to do it because they're potentially having a social impact on your local government area.
Not potentially, they are.
They are.
You take a population of the Barcaldine Regional Council of around 3,000 and turn it into one of, you know, closer to 4,000. You're a 25% population boom. You are
having an effect.
Having an effect on social structures right through the council area.
And I suppose the Mayor raised a good point as well, just being aware of the impact that this would have on your local government area and ensuring that you're comfortable with that level of impact. Whilst it's not impact accessible, at the end of the day, planning is about assessing impacts. That's what we have to do.
And Stephen, at this point in time with the negotiations, is it what Waratah are suggesting to council? There's some broad sort of contribution amounts dealing with water, sewer.
So what I've tried to just document is just the hard and fast facts around it, not bore you with the 24-page infrastructure agreement. I think one recommendation, while I touch on that, we make is it's a rather legalistic document, and it's an agreement, effectively a commercial agreement between you and the applicant as to your obligations.
Okay. I know you suggested there was probably no need to close the meeting, but using your exact words there, this is a legalistic commercial agreement between us and a developer. I think it would be appropriate under section 254(3)(g) that we do close the meeting, because there will be changes potentially to this and up or down. So, Councillor, with your leave, I think we should close for discussion around these conditions, given, I don't know if you're aware, it's not only a gallery like we are.
Yes.
So, I understand. Yeah. So can somebody please move that we close? Councillor Plum, Councillor Hanson, does anyone wish to speak against closing the meeting? No?
Sorry, just getting on that. So, how many minutes?
Plum and Hanson moved to be closed. And we were all in favour. Sorry, thank you.
As we answered.
Okay, so resuming planning report. So which do we want to discuss
So,
now?
Mr Mayor, I think we've just give you, councillors, just a very quick update on the draft planning scheme. So Stephen's helping manage that.
Hold on, where are we missing? Just gone. Oh, yes, right, okay, proceed.
So draft planning scheme, we came out in September and presented to you all about that. After, I know there were a lot of recommendations for amendments which we had to work through. Also that was then tabled, I think, to a next council meeting, the October meeting, and confirm if I'm wrong on that. Then we had to prepare what's called a state interest review package. So we effectively worked through, once we've got the final planning scheme, we sit down and work out how we're going to articulate how we've actually incorporated each of those state interests. There are 16 state interests, it takes a little while to work through them all. We then send off a letter, all documented up, saying here it is for state interest review. The state, after some backwards and forwards as to how we addressed the letter, of all things, that was their first worry. They have received it. The state government bureaucracy, wonderful. They've now received it. I've had conversations with the state both last year and early this year about their progress. They are currently looking at it. The intention is to have a workshop very soon, just to run through effectively where their preliminary findings are found. What they want to try and do, an approach that's often used, is to, I suppose, have meetings up front rather than them go through it, generate a trawl of comments that we then have to work through, instead kind of raising issues up front and us potentially dealing with them earlier. So I suppose there's not so much an update from a technical side, but more a process side. So we're in the process, the ball is in their court. We will keep monitoring that and keep seeking updates from them as required.
Questions? Planning scheme?
So we don't, we're not required to do anything at this stage?
No, the ball's in their court, we wait for them. We'll just keep chasing them up. They can. The annoying thing is the state imposes deadlines on themselves, but they are very good at not meeting them, from my experience. And there is no consequence. Like, what do you do? Take them to court? So, yeah, we just sit and wait. The name of the game is to not cause grief as much as you can, because you get them offside and then it just creates animosity.
We've got a very good working relationship with the Department of Local Government, State Development and Planning, and we'd like to keep that.
Yeah, we understand.
We will do our best to maintain that, or not, if not improve it.
Very good.
One matter of discussion early on with the officers was just around natural hazards. So the approach we took in relation to that was, obviously the planning scheme started as a state-sponsored scheme and the state was drafting it, and then helpfully handed it over to you and said, here, sort it out, which is when we came on board to fix it. There was a report done in relation to natural hazards at the time. We had the choice, once we had the scheme drafted, to update that report. However, we felt it was inappropriate to do it at that stage, given that the state then may request further changes, and a bit of back and forth. So we didn't submit with that report on the basis that we have a meeting with them first, get their feeling, and then at least draft a report in one go that matched up. It's just obscure to be given a kind of report that reflects a scheme that was, a year old or something, and then have to try and adapt that to meet a scheme that you're then probably going to change again. It's like
so the natural hazard stuff is flooding, bushfire.
Yep, landslide if it applies to a limited degree. There's a tiny little bit of landslide, I think, somewhere. And you don't have to deal with coastal hazard, luckily.
Yeah.
Very lucky.
So it's mostly bushfire and flood.
Bushfire and flood, particularly flood around Alpha. So we can, I suppose, once we have a further update on the scheme, provide a meaningful update on the technical side later on. And that's all I have for the scheme.
Okay. Does anyone have any questions on section 2 that Councillor Plum has declared a PCOI in? Anyone want to discuss that? Status of that planning inquiry? No, so you don't have to leave the room, Councillor Plum. And now we are going to discuss the
ski park and
the levy.
Yeah.
So, councillors, everyone was right at this point.
Look, I suppose, as the Mayor I think has touched on, the nature of today is, with Councillor Peoples, as he talked about, it's just a briefing on where we're at. In this matter, Council is the applicant in the levy matter. but also obviously the assessing authority. We work for council as the assessing authority, but I think it's also remiss of us to not provide you advice in relation to your role as the applicant, just to ensure council isn't high and dry. So in terms of just a brief history, I know most of you, if not all of you, are probably very well aware of this project, but in terms of a planning side, the ski park itself was subject to an MCU application, and then an MCU approval was issued by council to council for that. There was a condition in that approval requiring further assessment of flooding and then the identification of a flood solution to effectively avoid impacts. I'm just finding the approval because I will quote you the actual condition. So it's condition 7 of the approval for future efforts. If you need to look it up, I'm happy to circulate it if required. So some reporting was required and then a preferred solution needs to be identified, and that flood hazard assessment needed to be submitted to council for the chief executive's endorsement. So that was the requirement of the MCU approval. So that reporting was all completed. Yep.
Sorry, can you repeat that clause again? Before, the bit before the submit. So a report has to be prepared. The flood hazard assessment study submitted to council for the CEO's endorsement prior to. Who determines the flood assessment studies? Suitability and accuracy.
That would be based on hydraulic engineering advice.
So that's part of the endorsement process, is effectively the chief, like if the
But in terms of lowering to mitigation, I mean, is there a standard, a written standard that all mitigation in Queensland has to comply to in terms of what is the increased level that you're required to mitigate against and restore to, or is that open to interpretation by?
I take Rick's advice because he's the engineer. Obviously, I'm not an engineer, but it comes down to what a tolerable impact is. That's the test. Rick, correct me if I'm, correct me if I'm wrong, but that is open to interpretation in terms of what a tolerable impact is.
It's really missed in there. Civil's my area, not hydrology, so yeah.
So if I
would have to.
At the end of the day, man, my understanding is part of the contention at the moment is working out. I think my understanding at least is that tolerable is the test and that tolerable is subject to interpretation. It's working out what interpretation council takes in that matter.
And the council has engaged a flooding engineering company to actually provide guidance on mitigation measures.
We have.
And that will inform the risk profile of this.
I suppose just to clarify, you've actually got 2 engineers working for
Yeah,
you. You've
we
got engineers, ACS actually preparing the application. You've got another engineer reviewing that. That's a good practice.
Helping us
on our side. So it's a good practice to be in to make sure that one engineer is just double checking everything. That report has been prepared on the basis of the levy being the preferred solution and submitted as part of an operational works application to seek approval for the levy itself, to construct the actual levy. That's currently in the application process. It hasn't been decided. I understand that funding wasn't secured for the levy, and that's the position we're in at the moment. As a result, the state is a referral agency for that application and has issued an information request. Council, as the assessing authority, has the ability to make an information request. Council, as the applicant, has now suspended all those periods to effectively stop any further action on that levy application, because it's likely, unless we can sort out the funding arrangement, the council wouldn't proceed with that levy and would instead look at an alternative option to resolve the flooding issues. So what we're
Probably
talking
not likely the council would. It's likely the council may explore other options rather than proceeding too far down the track that we can't fund. Yes. So it's not that the council is not indicating that we won't build the levy. It's just that seeking further approvals is expending further money in an area that may be developed, whether an alternative may be developed or explored.
Very well summarised by the Mayor. So what we're here to talk about today is how we proceed. Both, I suppose, our concern is with the actual application we're assessing, but that also impacts your broader strategy in relation to what you're actually proceeding with a technical solution. I suppose in a broad sense there are a number of different ways you can proceed, and I can talk briefly about those. Again, we can think up a number of different options until the end of the day, but the first of which was to do nothing and to determine that the tolerable test is satisfied. On the basis of the numbers I've seen and the experience I have in similar matters, I think council would be stepping well beyond its technical in terms of us assessing it. We're talking about, and again, correct me if I'm wrong on the numbers because it's from my recollection, we're talking about an extra foot of water in some locations. My experience is 10 millimetres is acceptable. So we're talking...
So once again, that was the question I was going to before.
Yes.
Experience, 10 mils acceptable. Is there a legal precedent that establishes that that is the tolerable increase, or is that the way, where do we source what, fundamentally, council can't make any decision around mitigation until it understands that fundamental principle.
Yeah.
What is tolerable?
Yeah.
And how is it defined?
As Brooks rightly pointed out, we get into the hydraulics of the matter. I'm speaking from experience in terms of other matters where someone has applied. So this is a matter of Mackay, as an example, out in the Pioneer River Valley, where it was 10 millimetres. The council was applying as if you went any more than that, they weren't accepting it. So again,
but whether that had a legal foundation or not
is a question.
Is a question, and every circumstance is going to be different depending on at what point in time that flood risk, whether it's Q100, the 1 in 100 year flood, or
I suppose the difficulty there too is when you do flood modelling, you're talking absolutes. So we're talking absolute level would be 30, but you then also
plus or minus 500.
Sorry.
Well, all flood models, unless there is an actual event of that exact classification, engineering standards say they are what we are showing you plus or minus 500. So if it says 300, it could be 800.
Sorry, I thought you were back for a minute. I was like,
no. That's the thing. So it's all plus
they're
or minus.
only as accurate.
Correct.
The other thing we then look at in terms of, and again, I'm not an engineer, so I'm talking from experience working with engineers, but you also then look at the duration of that event. So if for 2 seconds the event hits 30 and then goes back down, maybe that's tolerable. It's all about duration and nature. It gets quite complicated in terms of what an engineer is willing to commit to as being tolerable. The ultimate test you try and aim for, the best solution, is you get to a pre-development situation. So you completely manage your flood impacts so that the flood impact is the same. Hey, if you can get it to less than what you were before, that's even better. Remembering, of course, that council is involved in this. It's council as the applicant, council as the assessing authority.
But as I was just going to say, as it currently stands, the engineers acting on council's behalf are looking at alternative scenarios at the moment and have not come to a final resolution.
In terms of actually doing work, physical work.
Okay, so I just want to go through the reality of this situation, and I'm very cognizant of very open there. At a 1 in 100 flood, there is one dwelling that goes from dry to wet. All other premises that flood that have an increase in flooding as a result of the development were already flooded.
Yeah.
I understand other councils use a precedent that a 10 mil increase in flooding is in for greater than 10
I raise
mil.
that purely as an example.
I understand, and that's what we need as examples. But what council's ability to determine tolerability is what I'm hearing is it's council's ability to determine that.
That's
because there's
on the basis of hydraulic advice that you're currently receiving.
Well, no, I'm going on the other side, on the basis that there's no written legal definition for an intolerable flood event in state legislation.
There is guidance, again, I'm speaking outside my realm of knowledge, but there is guidance in engineering practice around what, you don't just say, oh, that's tolerable because I feel like it. There are guiding principles around what you determine to be tolerable.
No doubt. So
it's a grey, as well.
If council was to be able to mitigate the building or the premises that was dry previously and becomes wet as a result of, it could determine, and I'm not. There's certainly no prejudiced position from me on this, but I'm trying to really get down to the exact planning options we have. Whether it's consistent with what other councils in your experience have done or not. Council could determine that the other dwellings that are affected, it's not an intolerable outcome because they were already so substantially flooded as a result of a Q100 pre-construction that the difference post-construction is accepted. So that is possible.
That is possible within the realm of what we're talking about. There are two considerations to that. We're dealing with the planning side of things. So with my planner hat on, I'd say to you, if you get an engineer to tell me it's tolerable, I look no more. If they're putting their hand, they're the engineer, I'm not an engineer. So I take that report and, if something is wrong, they did it, not me. I'm not within the realm of engineering. The other thing you need to consider, so we can issue an approval, everything, all good. The thing you need to consider though is the other side. And I'm only raising this because
we need to consider all of it.
We need to consider all of it. For council needs to consider all of it. We don't care politically what happens, but you need to be careful about the idea of what you're determining to be a tolerable impact for yourselves versus others, or if this was someone else with purely we're protecting ratepayers hats on, would you let someone else do that?
Understood.
Or are you giving yourselves a free ride? Or
so that's the
is someone
value judgment at the end of the day.
Or is someone perceiving that you can have all the technical evidence in the world, but if someone as a ratepayer perceives you're giving yourselves a free ride, they make noise, and that's the political side. I won't give any more advice on that because it's well beyond my realm.
To complete the picture on a political basis is the challenging aspect that we've got here around approving mitigation post-construction.
Yeah.
This conversation would be a totally different construction if the development in its initial stages was still under consideration.
Yes, that's right.
Because we're now looking at
or
the
not
reality
built.
of the fact. Well, what I'm saying is the reality is it's there. The threat exists that those dwellings will have a tolerable or an intolerable.
And that is the fundamental point. It's there now. It is built. If it wasn't built, I'd say to you, do you really need it there? Can we look at relocating it? You can't go and relocate a ski park. We went out this morning and had a look at it. You can't move that. It's there. It's done. So as much as it's a bad situation, you just need to navigate the bad situation.
Okay.
So what Rick is looking at the moment, the tolerable component is an option. In my experience, I think you are pushing well beyond what would be acceptable. Again, I'm not an engineer.
But that's up to the engineers.
It's up to the engineers on the technical side, but I think from that political side, a foot of water is a lot of water in flooding terms when they get it down to millimetres type thing. The second option is to buy back properties that may be affected to a component. I'm listing all options on the table. It's unusual, but again, it's an option that may just solve that more ratepayer side of things if people are causing noise. The third option, which Rick is looking at, and again, I suppose 3 has A, B, C, D all the way down, is then a technical solution that's not a levy that could be a lot less costly. What we're generally talking about is some form of offline storage detention. And Rick, if you're happy, I'll just summarise this in layperson terms for the councillors so they understand it. I'm no hydraulic engineer, but I've had the joy of dealing with many of them over the years, so I've had to kind of simplify all their jargon. Effectively at the moment, because of the ski park being built there, it's reduced the amount of storage that's in, and also affected the flow in that floodplain. So the water can't actually go where the ski park is at the moment until it overtops at a Q100 event. But in those lower events, it can't actually get in there. So it's affected the hydraulic performance where the water goes effectively. So in no difference to in a bathtub, if you go and sit in the bathtub, the water rises. Very basic kind of principle. With the railway line there, the flow is what we call regulated. So there's only so much space underneath the railway line. The railway line is generally built up to, I was talking to Rick, we don't actually know when it exactly goes over the top of the railway line, but general principle railway lines are always built to be generally about the Q100. Queensland Rail back in the day were pretty smart. So that regulates your flow. So what we're actually getting is because they haven't got storage downstream, you're actually getting the flow kind of dispersing broader and higher. So that's why you're getting houses flood. The purpose of the levy was to push the water away from the houses across to the farming land on the other side. The alternative to doing that hydraulically is you dig a big hole and the water then flows into that. So no different to getting a bucket and pulling it out effectively. The idea with such a facility would be free draining, so it wouldn't have water in it permanently. It would be purely when it floods, it backs up, it pushes into that. I won't get into the technical aspects of how that works hydraulically, but effectively the pipe at the bottom which would then free drain it fully. There are a number of different options as how you design it. The reason it gets so complicated is you also need to look at different flood events. So you've probably heard about Q1, Q2, Q10 all the way up to a Q100. They're different likelihoods, different sizes of events. I've seen instances where you can solve your Q100 problems, but you actually cause more issues at a Q50 just because of the way water works. It's a lot more complicated than just thinking it's a bucket of water. The bucket of water moves over time. So you actually end up with graphs depending on the time of when water flows in different spots. And it can be quite insane in terms of you can actually model each minute and where the water goes depending on each minute if you get that sophisticated. So I suppose it's a dark art and they do earn their money working it out, and that's what Rick's managing at the moment is if there is a solution. I think at the end of the day, council is going to have to do something. It's just whether you can get something that you can actually fund that is probably within that tolerable test. And it's probably seeking advice from the engineers on what is tolerable first. So I don't, the levy kept them high and dry, obviously, to its point, but it's what's tolerable first and then what's politically tolerable or tolerable.
Well, it's just the cost factor associated with the levy, and you've got the road to Aramac and the rest of it. So they're just there's always an engineering solution. It's just about what cost, and that's just going to be weighed up against that risk profile that we talked about a bit before.
Just a point I'll raise is the idea that at the moment, obviously, the community, certain members of the community aren't particularly happy about the levy. We actually saw a sign when we were out there this morning in terms of complaint about it, which was helpful because we could see how high it was, to be honest, if that's accurate or was a question. This may seem like council is in a spot of bother in relation to not being able to fund the levy. It potentially can be turned around as we've listened to you and we're no longer pursuing the levy. And instead we found a better solution. That's subject to find a better solution. I suppose it's all around messaging in terms of, we haven't gone big with our tail between our legs and gone, we can't get the money, so we're going to find a plan B. In actual fact, the plan B might end up better. I was talking to Rick about whether there is opportunity. At the moment, obviously, the current issue...
To be clear, we have not abandoned the levy.
No, you haven't abandoned the levy.
We've just halted the approval process.
Correct. And that's option 4 or option 0, proceed with the levy as planned. Sorry, my understanding was that the funding is probably not going to come across. But again, if you find funding, then it probably solves your problem there as well. So that is indeed an option. The other thing I did talk to Rick about just before was, obviously the current concern is around the ski park, but there is already flooding there. So potentially while you're digging a hole, there may be the option to actually further flood-proof Barcaldine while you're doing those works. So while you're digging there, you may as well just dig a bigger hole. By proposing it that way...
It comes down to cost, that's all.
Cost, but the reason I raise that is because if you're going from solving a problem with the ski park to then solving a problem with the ski park and also solving some of Barcaldine's issue, not all of them, potentially that makes funding a little easier in terms of applying for funding. Flood mitigation works as a whole. I'm just raising every single possible option in terms of my experience.
Councillors, bearing in mind two councillors have flagged an MPI, we are not debating as a result of this briefing or this report the veracity of our options, but I'm now opening for questions around so that we can seek advice from officers about any elements of what we've just heard as essentially 4 options. I'll re-summarise them for clarity. Doing nothing, so assuming the impact is tolerable, and your advice is that we're probably pushing the boundaries with your experience with the 300 mil.
Yeah, just qualifying not a high.
Can I just ask a question on that? Is if you do nothing, when does the tolerable test come in? Do we have to wait for a flood to test it, or do we?
No, so the hydraulic engineer, part of their job is they do a report and they summarise what the flood impact is based on what scenario they've tested. They then summarise recommendation, we consider this tolerable, and that's that report that then gets submitted to the CEO to then the CEO confirm, yes, these engineers who are qualified in the area have confirmed it's tolerable, I'm satisfied it's tolerable, move on. That's why engineers, particularly hydraulic engineers, have very high PI costs, probably professional indemnity, because they're making commitments. Yep. Nobody dies when I give advice.
So we've got a do nothing option with an assumption of tolerable impact based on reporting and definition of tolerable and intolerable. We have the option to buy back affected properties. We have the option to mitigate via alternative arrangements around either offline storage, detention, or dredging.
Some other hydraulic.
That affect other hydraulic solutions, or the levy. Essentially what I'm seeing as the 4 options that council's got available to it at this time.
Yep. There are, just to clarify, there's probably also a combination of all 3.
Correct.
Or all 4.
Yeah.
In terms of
so there's each one in isolation or
a combination. That's just the way engineering works.
Theoretically, you could buy back a property and do nothing about the rest. So, or a combination
some
of all
offline storage, and then get it down to that tolerable level. So it may not be that you get, we're talking about a foot at the moment, you might not get it back down to 0, but you could get it halfway, or whatever the engineers are then satisfied is intolerable. I think it's a better look if council's at least done something. The do nothing is about, admittedly, if you could justify it technically, that's the balancing act you've got.
Yeah.
All right. Council's questions. As I said, we're not debating the options today because that's not an agenda item, but what is an agenda item is that we will receive a report about this, which we have, and it's public. So, question? I'm going to went to you first, Jess. Sorry.
I was waiting for Jess to.
Do you have any questions?
No, I'm right, thanks, Mr. Mayor.
I'm right at the moment, thank you.
The full or hydraulic report that comes back with tolerable, intolerable, XYZ, when do we look like then to see it, able to see it? Not to hold anyone to anything, Mr. Mayor.
No, but there was work
week,
undertaken tomorrow or something for one element of it.
So we've done a variety of different things through the engineering we've engaged, the engineering company we've engaged to do this work for us. And they're running a number of scenarios to work out where we get the water back down. One of those is increasing underneath the roller line, so increasing the gap under there. Another one is retention storage, as Steve was saying before. They're running a number of scenarios of where best to dig those holes in the creek. Obviously, accompanied with that is further approvals through DNRME to be able to dig a hole in the creek to do that. So to answer your question, I would think we will have something early next week, or I will have something early next week, and then it's a matter of, that's the initial figures on it. Then it's a matter of putting that into a report back to council, so next council meeting will be Monday. Yep.
So if the report's in the next week or two, Mr. Mayor, then we'll get some further guidance from the external engineers that are helping council assess that as well, and then an informed decision can be made.
I think particularly where we're looking at the tolerable test, having two engineers involved is a good safeguard for council in terms of just not committing one person to it. You're getting that double checking, that peer review.
So just for the basis of when determining, when council makes its determination about this, I think we need in the material we're presented at the time to be in receipt of costings. So estimated construction costings for levy, estimated construction costings for the mitigation, and with the levy I mean all associated works, road construction, the whole works. Mitigation, what that, not only what that looks like and how effective that would be, but what the cost involved in that is. The purchase of properties, fair income valuation on that so that we understand what the true cost to council is. Because as you said before, there could be a number of these solutions that are equally palatable. If it's determined that we can use one or two solutions that has the same outcome, both in a political sense but also in a exposure to risk sense, then council may be able to use cost as a determining factor.
And that's very common in terms of if you've got, say, 5 properties where there's a 10 mil increase or something, so you can get away with that, but there's one property where you just can't hydraulically solve it. The option, hydraulically, you might be able to solve it by doubling the capacity of your thing, or you just buy the one property and it's probably cheaper. So that's potentially a combination. I completely agree.
And the one that'll be slightly harder to cost is the do nothing option. What the, not opportunity cost, it's the reverse of that, what the threat cost is of doing nothing, in terms of legal exposure. So that one would be.
And I think.
So I guess what we can see there, what we could get a briefing on is doing nothing, what immediate legal exposure we may have through the regulations and planning. Then subsequent to that, the one that worries me even more is the do nothing and then the event of.
Then wait.
Is it a matter, and I think that's probably what you were asking, Brett, that we didn't get right to the point of. If doing nothing happens, is council actually not exposed? Once again, I'm not prejudicing, that's what I think, but when's the point of exposure? Is it when a Q100 happens, when they actually get wet? Or is it because we're not... Sorry?
There's varying degrees of exposure in terms of... So from a planning sense, we take the technical advice of the engineer. Someone could raise court action in relation to the idea that council hadn't assess the application correctly, and then the court will determine whether that was correct or not, and then you get full
But that,
blown.
but that would be the do nothing. Yeah.
That's the do nothing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you do nothing, there's
So
that.
the application would be withdrawn almost because there's no need for the levy ban. So yes,
Also, levy. Yeah.
there could be litigation, I guess, in advance or tomorrow. But that maybe is a matter for King to advise the council.
I suppose that there are two aspects to that do nothing option. I think we talked about this briefly before, but the first of which is where the council has, as the assessing authority, done everything technically correct in terms of that tolerable test. Again, if we can seek the advice of the engineers without necessarily directing them any way what they're happy to accept as a level, that is the best port of call, because then they're independently looking at it. The second of which is then those consequences of not necessarily council having done anything technically or legally wrong, but the ramifications of when it does flood. Someone says, well, it didn't flood before and now it does. And the problem you've got is because flooding doesn't happen now, people can see a map and go, oh yeah, it's fine. They don't fully appreciate the nature of it until it actually happens. As you've also touched on there, no flood is exactly what's predicted. So your luck could be not on your side and you end up getting a Q500 equivalent or something slightly a bit different, and it's completely more worse than you anticipated. So,
yeah, although we're not required to mitigate to a Q500.
No, I mean, or that's not to the so the technical side. You go, no, it wasn't a Q100, it was a Q500. We've done everything right. It's more that political side.
Okay. Further. So I think we're through on what our options are there. The officers have got 4 options to present back to us at points in time when everything is complete, and we'll get costings involved in that so that we can use that as to help us with their assessment of the options or selection.
Can I ask one question, Councillor Mayor?
Please.
With the digging of the holes, that is actually in the creek section. It wouldn't be outside the creek. It'd be in the creek.
Generally, it honestly depends on the hydraulics in terms of whether they actually need it. It gets rather complicated in terms of where they physically would want to have it. You could potentially have multiple holes or one hole, or there's so many different options. Again, it gets down to engineering. But you can't have it far divorced and pipe it out and back. It would generally be part of the creek bed.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question? Just in the case that we decide to purchase properties, what if some of those people were not, like, so we've made an offer to purchase, but then they didn't want to sell. What happens? Like, does that just take away our responsibility because they have chosen to keep that property?
Purchasing properties is a pretty rare situation. I know in Brisbane, as an example, I think there's a total of 10 properties I think the council's purchased to date. And most of that has been kind of voluntary offers of, hey, you guys go underwater a lot, it's historic, so hey, we'll just buy your property and we'll solve everyone's problems. Because it's not really a legally regulated thing in terms of buying properties. It would be also down to council as the planning authority what you've actually requested that they do. In terms of like us as the planning officers have said to council as the applicant, you must buy back this property. That's a bit. If they don't do it, then you, like we were saying with the power station, you kind of shot yourself in the foot because you can't actually achieve it.
But there is the resumption of land act.
Yes.
That's the other
compulsory
option.
acquisition.
That's a different touch.
And that's I do a fair bit of that work in Brisbane in
Probably
terms
more
of
versed to talk about that.
yeah, under separate under compulsory land acquisition legislation. So it would be if it's for a public purpose and there is a clear link to that public purpose, the reason why it's being resumed, then the people are compensated based on highest and best use as at the date the land is resumed. And so there is valuation evidence then put forward as to what that value is, and if there's any dispute about the valuation, the other party, the affected party, can get their own valuation at council's cost. And then come to an agreement on what is the highest and best use and what is the ultimate valuation to be paid for the resumption of that land.
So I suppose in that option there's a couple of different avenues you go down to acquiring that land. The first of which is a friendly offer that is accepted, or ultimately a resumption matter, which again is a legal proceeding.
And a resumption matter is final. The only thing that's not is the price. So it can't be reversed, like a decision of council or state government to resume land for the purposes of a public thing, whether it's a road or in this case, it's pretty clear what it is.
It'll be taken. Yeah.
That's not a decision, like once the council decides to do it, there's nothing that can undo it, only council not paying an agreed to figure.
To provide context on that, there's plenty of resumption matters where the land's gone, like literally the road or whatever it is has already been built, and you're talking about a block of land that's no longer there. You're still debating over extra cost in an appeal, which makes appeals quite difficult because you can't actually go and look at the block of land because it's now a road. So
massive precedents all through major cities with this, where a highway goes, a street goes from 2 lanes to 4 to 6 to 8. You know,
you'll never stop the resumption. It's just a matter of unless you want to
ways in Brisbane, there's always been disputes on highest and best use and valuation. The council will get a valuation done. The affected party will get a valuation. If they don't agree with that valuation, they'll get a valuation done.
Correct. Just a question on your experience on valuations with the flooding. Normally, you take into account the scheme.
You would just look at the highest and best use as at the relevant date that it is resumed, and you would likely ignore what we say the scheme of resumption, which in this case is anything that's influenced any change in the flood regime. So it's really as it was
pre-scheme.
Yeah.
So you're not going to get a situation where you flood someone's property and then say it's floodable land, we can now take it for cheap.
Yeah.
All right. What about any other questions, planning questions at all?
Sorry, Mr. Mayor, just through you again with that issue. Can we make sure that in very quick time we get back to our residents that are affected by this? And touch base with them.
Just to let them know.
I know this is public, but make a point to go and say that it was, or unaware of the agenda. But just to say that it was discussed and
a bit of detailed discussion around this.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Any other planning questions related to this or otherwise? Okay, well, you get to have lunch and smoker. We can book it with a meal.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Righto. Thank you. Thanks, Jeff.